Hi, I'm Emma McRae. I'm a curator at the Australian Centre for the Moving Image, and I'm here with Lella Smith, who's the creative director of the Walt Disney Animation Research Library, which houses the art from every Disney animated film from the 1920s. Lella's been overseeing this collection for the past 18 years, and she's also the curator of the exhibition Dreams Come True, the art of Disney's classic fairy tales. Lella, can you tell us where the idea for the exhibition came from and how the exhibition developed?
Sure. Well, it was really John Lasseter's idea. The production crew went to New Orleans with John, the directors, the producer, the lead animators, the stylists. They saw New Orleans after the devastation of Katrina, and John said, I really want to do something for the people of New Orleans. He said, can we take an exhibition there? And it was about a year away. I said, yes, we can take an exhibition there. We called the New Orleans Museum of Art, and John Bullard, who was the director, said, oh, we would love to have a Disney exhibition. I'm such a fan. But there was one problem. They had almost no staff left after Katrina. He said, you guys will have to do everything. So that meant that our designers designed the layout and the posters and all the publicity materials. I wrote the labels with the researchers, and then I wrote the catalog. And it was a huge project to do in 1 year, but we had such satisfaction when it opened, and we were able to bring school children back into the museum, and there had been no school groups since Katrina.
And the exhibition contains, it's got concept art, story sketches, animation drawing, layouts, backgrounds, but the collection has over 60 million pieces of art. So how did you make that selection? Because you needed to cut it down significantly.
We did. It was tough. It's always like, which of my children shall I not take? But we focused on the story because the whole purpose of the exhibition was to talk about fairy tales and to compare the traditional tales to the way Disney told them. And so that being said, we looked for the best element to tell the various beats of the story. And sometimes it was story sketches, sometimes it was animation drawing. But that was really the thing that helped to guide us. And then sometimes we had to make very painful decisions. But we went from about 1,500 down to about 600.
That's, a big cut. Mm-hmm. And those films, there's quite a difference in the stories as well. Disney obviously adapted those traditional tales to make the Disney version of the stories. So was that part of the exhibition, the development of the exhibition, or was that the original idea?
It's interesting. It had always bothered me that Walt Disney was criticized for changing the fairy tales, because fairy tales, by their own nature, change constantly. For centuries, they were oral stories. In the 16, 17, and 1800s, they began to be written down, and then in the 19th century, there were beautiful illustrations done for them. But with every telling, they changed. And then along came Walt Disney, who needed to take those stories from sometimes a 2 or 3 page story into an hour film. So a different medium, a different way of telling it. So obviously there would be changes made. And he was focusing on family entertainment, so there were often things that were eliminated because they weren't family friendly. And so, it was interesting for me to read the various versions of the stories and see how very much they had changed. Probably the one that surprised me the most, because it'd been years since I'd read the traditional tale, was the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs story. Because in the Grimm's brother fairy tale, Snow White is 7 years old, and the queen is her mother. And if you can imagine the mother trying to kill her daughter 3 times, it was horrifying. Not that it should be a stepmother, but it was easier to tell that story somehow. And there was, it was amazing how many subtle changes were made. For instance, the dwarfs in the traditional story were tidy little men who really weren't that keen on Snow White staying with them. How much more fun it was to make them messy and to have Snow White win them over in such a charming way, have the animals become her friends and help her find a place to stay. So I began to understand a little bit better why some of the changes were made. And that was one of the things we wanted to tell people is these weren't random changes. They were well thought out. I've probably read 40 hours worth of story notes on the dwarfs alone, and what they should look like, what they should be called, should they be realistic, should they be tall. One interesting thing about the dwarfs is that Dopey, you'll notice, doesn't have any facial hair. And at first, the way he was drawn, he was quite tall and came off looking like he was not quite right. And so they didn't want anybody to think that they were making fun of disabled people. So they made him childlike. And so that's why all the other dwarfs have hair and Dopey doesn't. There were a lot of decisions like that made.
And I guess a lot of those decisions are made by the artists who are working on the concept and the development of the characters. And some of the pieces in the ARL collection are by some quite significant artists like Mary Blair and Ivan Earle. And so can you tell us a bit about their significance, not only within Disney history, but within the animation history?
Sure. Well, it's kind of hard to know who to cover. There's so many important ones. But at the time that the early films were made, certainly during Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella, the company reached out to well-known artists, some of them even fairy tale artists, and fairy tale illustrators, excuse me. And Walt Disney looked to them to help illustrate these stories. One of them, and Walt Disney actually even offered a job to Arthur Rackham, but he was retired and living in the countryside. But Kai Nielsen, for example, came to the studio. Kai Nielsen has done some wonderful books on fairy tales. So he was a well-known name before he came into the studio. He hired several Europeans. There's a artist by the name of Horvath, who was Hungarian and was a tremendous illustrator. So he gave lots of inspiration. Gustav Tingren, who went on to do many children's books, not just for the Disney group, but outside of Disney, Golden Books and such. And he came to the studio and worked on the early fairy tales. And the reason was that Walt Disney wanted to have the best. The artists were already classically trained, but he brought teachers to the school and he continued their education. He had artists like Mark Davis, who worked on the characters of Aurora and Maleficent and Cinderella. But they were tremendously talented artists from Chouinard, which was a very famous art school in California at the time. It's become CalArts now. And he would turn to these people to have them train the young artists so that this learning process continued. And they became very important in the Disney legends. There were 9 animators called the 9 Old Men who were classically trained, and by that I mean trained to be artists. And so we have the work of people in the show like Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. And we look to these artists because they represent the best of what was Disney. Their artistry was so outstanding that they're always the artists that the students want to seek out. So we tried to include all of them in the show.
And Disney himself, Walt Disney, wasn't only closely involved in the artists who were coming and working at the studio, but he was very keen to develop new techniques constantly and new ways of making animation. So what are some of the innovations that have been developed at the Walt Disney Studio during all those years?
Well, there were many, many cameras developed. Walt Disney worked in the early days out of a garage, out of his uncle's garage, so it was real bare bones. But he started to develop the kind of cameras that could help him do his films. And of course, one of the most significant of the inventions was the multiplane camera, which allowed the artist to photograph from the top of a long piece of equipment that had platens that could go back and forth and up and down. And with the camera up here, as they would put a drawing down, snap a picture, put the next one down, snap a picture, and move it just a little bit. When they played that quickly, not only did you get the motion of animation, but you could be rolling the platens up, so you could feel like you were moving through the scene. And so that really gave a feeling of a live action film. And that was one of the most significant things that was created. Another thing that isn't maybe as well known is that Walt Disney was the first person to realize that you could take story sketches, create a story in the story sketch, pin them up on a board, and if it didn't work, then you could start moving the story sketches around. And that, of course, has been used in Hollywood for many years. There were so many things.
And that's the storyboard.
The storyboard, that's right. And if you look at the way that animation developed, in the early days, you would have a Snow White story sketch with a red pencil line to tell the camera where to look. And with time, they developed workbooks that allowed the cameraman to know how to shoot. And they made a lot of decisions based on what could give them the best product for animation. So there was a lot that was done.
Yeah. And so as part of the development of the whole studio, what was the beginning of the Animation Research Library? How did that start and come to become the collection that it is?
Well, it actually started in the early days because Walt Disney came from the world of advertising. So he was used to having a morgue, we gave up that name, that would keep the animation drawings. Initially they didn't keep so much of other things, but the animation drawings could be reused. With time, they began to keep more and more of the concept art and backgrounds. The reason that they kept the animation drawings is that that was what took the most time to do, and artists could go and look at the animation drawings that other people had done, study them, study the angles, and sometimes even reuse them. There are scenes that you will see, not too much, but you'll see scenes in cartoons that were reused from other films. So that was sort of the beginning of what is the Animation Research Library. But then it got so huge that it was kind of in the basement of a building, and kind of scary thought, not properly taken care of. So in the late 90s, the decision was made to have a formal library. I'm sorry, the late 80s, the decision was made to have a formal library. And so they found a space, and we had a facility built that is really quite nice. It's museum quality storage with the right kind of climate control and fire suppression system and the whole thing. So we hope to keep it around for a lot of generations.
Yes, well, and it's lucky for us that you do. Now, the exhibition has, as you said, over 600 artworks, which is quite a lot, but is there one that is a particular favourite of yours?
I do have favourites. Ivan Earle is an extraordinary artist to me. I find that his art is influenced by Asian art, Persian art, the art from the Middle Ages, and it's so aesthetically pleasing, so detailed. Sometimes they look like tapestries, they're so beautiful. So I am attracted to his concept and background pieces. It was also an important film for me because it was when I became aware of princesses when I was a little girl.
This is Sleeping Beauty.
Yes.
Lella, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure having you in Melbourne and speaking with you today.
It's my pleasure.